Thanks, Nivedita. That was wonderful. I'll invite Benno to come up and share his thoughts.
Good morning. I'm Benno de Kaiser from Cómplices por la Equidad. That's Men Engage Mexico. And if you can see the presentation. How can I present myself? I'm part of a generation that had confidence in progress. I come from the country where the word macho was created, referring to the male horse, the strong horse, and comparing that to the man, and find the word macho all over the world. But machismo is not only exclusively in Mexico. I live in a country, someone has called it, it's the perfect dictatorship. It looks like a democracy, but it isn't. I'm part of a generation that accompanied many changes, the hippie movement, the movement for being citizens, the 1968 movement, the anti-authority, anti-repression movement, and also the women's rights movement that surprised us men in many ways and still continues surprising. Apart from that, well, I have some training in medicine, anthropology, and mental health, and proud father of 5 daughters. Globalization, social, and gender injustice. I tried to change the title a little bit. I thank Alan and the committee for the invitation and the possibility of talking about this from a Mexican, maybe a Central American perspective. 3 years ago, I received the last email of a friend, a very close friend. I could call him a compadre, a co-father of my children. And he wrote me this. I was asking him to come visit from Chile, and he said, I don't have time. I need time to find old friends again in the same scenarios. I have promised myself to stop the machine, but I don't know how. He died from a massive heart attack about 4 or 5 weeks later. He got retired, and after a month of resting, he started working again passionately at the local university. I've been working on these issues, on the need to stop in issues like suicide, accidents, drug abuse, different kinds of drug abuse, and violence. Men need to stop. This photo was posted by an Argentinian young man in the army. He will be in the army for the next year, and he sends this to his girlfriend. He says, I love you, written in 22 bullets, and if you don't behave well, all these bullets are for you. That in itself is a crime, is a felony. But he posted it to his friends, and some of his friends maybe posted it to some other women friends, and through a collective internet of feminists, it came to me, and I share it here with you. So that's the way many men are reared in our globalized society. Starting the machine, how does this start? All these messages we get when we are small. This last message, watch your chickens, because my rooster is loose. Everywhere I go in Latin America, people know this phrase, and it has to do with pregnancy. But one asks, in this actual world, with HIV, with VPH, shouldn't the rooster be being taken care of himself, and the chickens that might have some relationship with him? Excuse my rusty English, I haven't practiced in a lot of time. How do you pick this up? What did I inherit from my father? What do I inherit from my siblings, my peers? But when we go further, this is more on the individual level, how does this relate to what happens in my family, in my group, in my peers, in my school? And in the macro level, the social level, the media. I was going to include some images of deodorant, how this leads students, young boys to buy certain deodorants, thinking that women will fall for them. Sylvester Stallone is still, he hasn't retired, and he should retire, and he's still portraying his own third age macho attitude, and how the media will even promote gender equity if this sells. They can promote either inequity or equity if it sells. The economic polarization, the 99 against the 1% who hold most of the power and the money, the transnationals that are rampaging our countries, and finally the state monopoly of violence. So a sociological and globalization perspective forces us to think about the general conditions that make possible or limit the process of change toward gender equality. And men are very connected to many of these globalized messages still. And I hope we start getting connected with the gender equity messages. I think it's about time. I link globalization with the ancient process of colonization. When did globalization start? With the internet? No. With the airplanes? No. Much before. For us, it started with the discovery of America. Native Mexicans, Native Americans say, we were already here when you discovered us. We had discovered our own country already. There was no discovery. Colonization is a deeply rooted practice centuries before the massive media and the internet. And nowadays, it still is a way of dominating through the economy, through exploitation of people and resources, international policies, and policing. I was asking myself, I don't know the answer, what the minimum wage would be in India. And consumerism through the media. I show some examples of this is a regal decision a man has to make, which beer he will drink. What young men consume, combined with rock and roll, violence and rock and roll, brutal assault, morbid angel, suicidal tendencies. How work also is influencing men daily, work associated with risk-taking and the role of providing, with all the risks that entails. In the last 40 years in Mexico, we talk about the economic crisis. A 40-year crisis is not a crisis. That's normality already. I'm still part of a generation where we had the sole male breadwinner, my father. What my mother did wasn't considered work. But now, if the family more or less lives at the same level, it's because it's several members working in that. And falling into what they call flexibilization, informality, and the consequent loss of rights, the right to pension, the right to complete health services. Many of the development strategies are being reduced. Now we're talking of poverty reduction, extreme poverty reduction. We forget poverty, but now we have to address extreme poverty, and zero hunger programs. Every time these policies of the so-called welfare state are reducing themselves. Save the children. I know there's an organization here called, well, we have to save the children now from these other issues. Associated with this economic chronic crisis is migration. People from Mexico, it's 12 million almost migrants, especially to the United States, some of them to Canada, trying to find survival, economical survival. And the same goes for Central America, especially Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And they cross Mexico with lots of danger. There's a humanitarian crisis in the border of Mexico because so many children are migrating alone, not with their father, not with their older brother. They're migrating alone, 10, 12, 14, 16-year-olds. If we see the principal causes of mortality in women and men, I didn't translate the causes, but it's you can see that the quantity compared to the causes of death in a healthy population, otherwise healthy population. In men, the 5 leading causes are violence. This is a 19th century painting, and it says, this is life. And it's men killing each other. We thought that this barbarism was going to be surpassed with development with civil rights. And we see, at least in the case of Mexico and many countries in Central America, that's not true. This is how deaths were declining until, at least in Mexico, in the last 10 years, there has been an enormous rise of deaths, though in the 40s it was higher, but we had a constant decline in these deaths. I want to dedicate this presentation to the 43 students that have been disappeared. I think you may be aware of that in the news. More than 43 days have gone by and they still haven't appeared. There's 50 people who have been detained. There's many versions of what happened, and we fear that the government is administering the truth. We already call it a crime of state. The students were handed over by the local police to a narco organization, and we hope they are alive, and we hope this meeting can hope the same. We can't stop. Many young men enter the narco. They don't have access to education. They don't have access to work. And once inside, it's very difficult to get out unless you are dead. And this is part of what we see of the process, what Hannah Arendt calls the banalization of evil. The phenomenon of the maras in Central America has a long history, and it has to do with social conflict in Central America, with the migration to the US, and things they learned from gangs there. How can we break this cycle? I won't read everything, but the cycle includes also impunity, corruption, the lack of opportunities, and this unjust economy, I hear, also occurs in India and many of our countries. And the question is, can gender revolution stand alone and only with the support of women? It has to link with men's efforts and also link with other important movements dealing with the planet, with citizen rights, and with class economic movements. I'm going to skip this part. I hope this comes in the page. Thinking about change, how we can think about change from a Freire perspective, but knowing, as Bourdieu tells us, that there's a strong resistance, there's a strong nucleus that has to be changed also. Václavic talks about change 1 and change 2. It's interesting to revise him. Change 1 is simulation, adaptation. Change 2 is real change, it's transformation. Sorry, I overbooked myself with slides. I want to end with thinking about 3 axes in an integral approach to working with men. I take this from Michael Kaufman and Michael Kimmel. Questioning the power in our relationships. Feminism has done that very well. Recognizing the pain and costs. Studies of masculinities have done that. And since the conference started, the ideas, and how can we get men on board and understand what's in there for them? How can we recreate and rethink new imaginaries with no machines that have to be stopped and socializing from other points of view? How can we articulate efforts? Here you can see the moment of the declaration in the 2009 conference in Rio. We're a little bit older right now. How do we get them? How will we get us to talk? That's not Michael Kimmel in that photo. It's how can we get men together and start sharing, and not only talking, but moving in the right direction. How can we work from an intercultural perspective? That's another thing we have to be with. Sometimes we look very much from a centralized, urban, middle-class perspective and ignore and don't listen to other perspectives occurring on the mainland. Some pictures about how changes are coming in the school system in Mexico with professional and parents. Less words and more art. The strategy is working with art as if with the media festival in this event. Men with age, the man that thinks in India, adapting and recreating the good models, preventing, how to spot and help prevent future homicides. There you have Marc Lepine from Montreal. Future homicides, suicides, and other violent deaths. Working both with boys and girls from a salutogenic perspective. I think we have to go much more up the river and understand what's happening with men who are not violent. Osvaldo did a work on that many years ago. Men who use condoms, we don't know who they are. Men who take care of their health, men who don't resort to violence to negotiate conflicts. I'm almost finishing. I have the red light already. We have to learn much more of what's happening on the good side, though in these days, at least in my country, we are quite pessimistic of what's going to happen. In Colombia, before they saw us as trash, now we recycle it. The resignification of many things, not only the resignification of plastic, but of people themselves. How can we be aware of our own gender limitations and other limitations? I think these stairs that we can scale up in gender, eventually we find ourselves in the mirror. And I would like to ask you, going back to these 43 students, we don't accept they are dead. We don't want to accept they are dead. They were taken alive, and we want them back alive. I was going to ask for a minute of silence, but I would prefer an applause of hope for these students and for us who are struggling for their coming back. Please, a round of applause for them. I will take that to Mexico. I hope this can be included, this phrase can be included in the final draft of this meeting. And to say that these students, they are studying to be teachers, and they should be in school right now. At this moment, they should be in school. I end with this phrase taken from the Guatemalans in their darkest days. They said, "They have taken our fruits, they have cut off the stems, they have burned our tree, but they cannot eliminate our roots." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benno. I'll invite Dina to come up.
Hello, thank you, everybody. Just need to set up. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and to Alan for organizing a session that I think is actually quite critical in relation to all the discussions we've been having. And my comments today are, I framed them, thank you, it's better, thinking about what I've heard in the past 2 days, rather than, what I want to do in the 15 minutes or so allocated to me is to give a sense of the broader structural forces of neoliberal capitalism, and of which corporate globalization is certainly one manifestation, of how these forces play out on the ground, so to speak, in present-day Bangladesh in relation to something specific, garment workers, but how they articulate in the lives of individual men and women. Basically, what I want to raise are how political economy intersects with the cultural formations in the making of male and female subjectivities, but also in the production, in how we think about violence. I proceed on the premise, and here I'm actually echoing what Alan said in his introductory comments, which is that targeting individual behavior, important as it may be, needs to be located within and complicated by an understanding of the broader structuring forces, especially of the market and the state, on lives and livelihoods. If we understand masculinity as behavior only, we will have missed something very important. And I think Nivedita's paper brought this issue up quite clearly. We need to look at how behaviors are related to structure. Individuals aren't disembodied atomic units who need to be convinced only of certain, to behave one way rather than another, and I think there is a tendency for us to think that. But they're embedded in specific socioeconomic, legal, and cultural environments. And perhaps in the discussion we can talk about the ways in which a certain kind of NGOization, and I'm not putting down NGOs as a whole, I think that kind of blanket statement simply doesn't work. I come from a country, Bangladesh, in which there are very different kinds of NGOs, some of which are very, very effective. But there's a certain kind of NGOization, especially of left movements, along with, in Bangladesh, the valorization of individual female empowerment that's tended to sideline analysis of not just the structural, but also of the political. And we need to put the political back in our analysis. So it's not just individual, atomized, what can we do with men, but looking at the larger terrain of the political, in which we can talk about power structures then. So, I don't know what kind of timing that is, Alan, but it says 11 seconds or something.
11 minutes.
Oh, 11 minutes left, sorry. Yes. I'm very slow. No, don't look at that. Okay. All right. Yeah,
You can slow down.
I can slow down? I thought I had to. Okay. All right. Okay. Let me start again. So, here we are in Mr. Modi's India, where Muslim masculinities have been in the news quite a bit in the last few months. The putative agents of a love jihad, which some of you have heard about, I'm sure, those menacing masculinities, in quotes, are centrally implicated in the production of a dangerous communal other. And, of course, we know, I'm sure you all know about how these ideologies mobilize groups and produce or enable violence. This kind of rhetoric that is in India right now, and I mention this because I want us to also think about the connections between the so-called the local and the national and the global, and how these discourses are very much interwoven and co-constitutive. But they dovetail with global discourses of the war on terror and ideas of Muslim men as always misogynist and violent. This effectively erases the political, glossing over the precarious position of most Muslims, men and women in the country, and can be has been a cover for violence on Muslim and other bodies, right? Now, I'm actually not going to talk about India, but I think it's interesting because across the border in Bangladesh, Bangladesh is seen as a place of the good Muslim, or as I like to say, the Muslim but moderate country, definitely not Pakistan. Right? This is the general impression of. So Bangladeshi men, on the whole, are not represented as being violent, lunatic mullahs, on the whole. Right? So, but this is a country where microcredit, microfinance entrepreneurs and garment factory workers have apparently been freed from the shackles of religious patriarchy and poverty by the market, of course. Indeed, and I will say, I don't want to make any blanket comments, but individual women, individual factory workers have certainly gained a measure of autonomy, confidence, and financial empowerment, and that they probably would not have had otherwise. Women factory workers are no longer seen as passive victims of capitalist exploitation, as early feminist scholars cast them. They have been reimagined as willing capitalist subjects. From this perspective, the ideal garment worker is a consumer citizen exercising her right to freedom, which means her right to consumption practices, among other things, right? Now, again, I don't want to be negative. I think there are some really interesting shifts going on, particularly since we're here. I'll talk about one thing that I noticed that studies have measured in male attitudes. So, for instance, and I got this information yesterday from one of the poster sessions, according to a recent study by IPPF and the Family Planning Association of Bangladesh, 31% of men surveyed in a study that was a South Asia regional study were willing to cook and wash clothes for their children. That's actually quite a lot. A third of men is not bad. And a vast majority of men, Bangladeshi men, and I don't know anything else about the study, a whopping 91% were in favor of access to abortion. And having just come from the U.S., where the religious right and all kinds of men and women have been against abortion. This is really a very impressive statistic. Clearly, change is possible, and we should hold on to our optimism. But, and I think here is the paradox. I think it's called a paradox. To me, it actually seems perhaps not so paradoxical. That despite having some of the best social indicators in South Asia, and despite women's very active and visible participation in the wage labor force, the level of violence against women, both public and private, are incredibly high. What is not sufficiently recognized are with the dots that are not connected, and I think Nivi's brilliant talk really put something out there that I haven't articulated in great detail here, is the kinds of marginalization and dispossession that accompany the kind of economic growth and success story that Bangladesh is. So there are, so among other things, because of this dispossession and inequality generated by the neoliberal model of economic growth, there are several things that we can just, flag. Violence has become routinized as a preferred mode of conflict resolution. Corporate notions of masculinity, of possessing women, there are these incredible billboards in Dhaka, and the gleaming hotels, they all, I would say, taunt men, taunt people who are outside of that promise of consumption and modernity. I'm not positing causality here, but I do think the two are not interrelated. Now, getting back to the garment industry, garment workers, there's a particular, also at the same time, with this neoliberal model of growth, there's a particular discourse of the female worker, the working class, the poor woman. Of course, we are all middle-class Bangladeshi women writing about and making policies about poor women, our poor sisters. But, the female is the responsible and disciplined worker. This idea carries within it an implicit marginalization of male labor. Men are understood to be lazy, irresponsible, and violent, and media coverage tends to reproduce this, and we're talking about poor men, of course. Now, before I go on, I should say I had this conversation this morning about men's rights. I'm not asking you to feel men's pain or endorsing a men's rights agenda. I'm calling for greater attention to the deeply entangled nature of gendered injustices, particularly in the casting out of people to the margins of the new economy, which is an extremely unequal but hyper-visible economy. It's very different. It's not just inside the malls or inside spaces. I think the new economy is everywhere. So women in the garment industry index a kind of modernity and pride for the middle class. It's, Bangladesh used to be the the basket case of the world. And now people can say with pride that we have arrived into a certain kind of modernity, right? Now, so there's that in the background. I want to briefly talk about the sexual harassment of garment workers in particular within factories and in public spaces. Now, within factories, I'll skip. It's easy, I'm sure. I think I'll go to the public spaces because I think that's more relevant here. There are, some of you in South Asia, I think, will know this, but there are 3 to 4 million women who work in the garment industry in Bangladesh in 2 urban centers, basically, and every day they walk to work and they walk back. And so you have literally hundreds of thousands of working women on the streets. It's an extremely visible signifier of many, many things. You can't escape the garment workers, right? So garment workers are actually subjected to incredible hostility from working class men on the streets. Even as they are celebrated as saviors and heroes of the nation, they are all they visibly, I would argue, embody a certain subaltern male failure. Their presence signifies not just the inability of male family members to be successful breadwinners. I think, with multinational capital's search for cheap labor that valorizes women, there's the marginalization of working class males, the absolute lack of prospects of their getting the same kind of jobs, of their being cut off from the promise of neoliberal modernity, brings about a certain, I don't know if I would call it a crisis in masculinity, because that's such a It's a term that's been critiqued a lot, and I won't go there. But what you see on the streets, and how one way to understand this incredible sexual harassment of garment workers in particular, is a kind of way for men to try and reclaim public spaces that used to be all male spaces. That if suddenly, you've seen this total reworking of social and sexual gendered urban spaces. So a way of securing masculinities has always been an unstable and contingent affair. But, and we know in the new corporate economy, masculinities may be recuperated through various consumption practices. But also through, I think here, when we're thinking about performance, it's through there's a kind of performance of sexual entitlement in public spaces that goes on with this sexual harassment. And it was very striking listening to the first paper. The mobile itself has become a very dangerous tool. There are many cases of girls, not just garment workers in this case, but I just feel like I have to share this, who have been gang raped, and the video of the rape, there's not just a video of the rape, but there are cases of the video being actually sold in local video stores for money, which is really quite incredible, because you would think that would be evidence of the rape that you would not want circulating, but clearly there's a whole other economy of violence going on. And I should emphasize, I'll just go to my conclusion, I should emphasize that it's not, in this case, it's not the mullahs, but the policemen and the rickshawalas, the young unemployed youth who sexually harass garment workers. Not that there isn't this whole other discourse on appropriate spaces of work for women, but here I think there's the fear of religious extremism in Bangladesh often becomes a cover for not looking more closely at neoliberal forms of development, and development becomes, as somebody said yesterday, kind of not really an empty signifier, but a very narrow one, very interested, one invested in a particular kind of neoliberalism. So where do we go from here? I do not do, solutions in that sense, but as Alan and I were speaking today, one of the things we both thought was important, that we haven't had so much attention to, is to study up, to look at the people who make policies and institutional arrangements, both global and national, because they make them with particular ideologies of development in mind, but also particular constructions of women in the South and men in the South in mind. And I think we need to see more of that. And if we're interested in intervening in violence against women, we need to have a good grasp of the logic behind macroeconomic decision-making. I'm all for denaturalizing the kind of developmentalist logic that we're so entrenched in Bangladesh at least. And the second thing, I think it's very critical to link struggles and movements. So if we're talking about garment workers, men and women, I think we can't do, it's very important to think about the connections, making connections with labor movements and organizing rights. And that sort of falls into, somehow we have, as one would say in development speak, these silos of work going on in different ways. And also thinking of empowerment not as an individual thing, but thinking of collective forms of solidarity and movement making. And finally, because we are on a panel on gender justice or injustice, I think we really have to expand our understanding of gender justice. We can't talk about women only. We need to think about the ways in which poverty, precarity, and the global system feeds into the local. And I don't think there's a hierarchy. I think these are made all together. Thank you.